Welcome to the Book Binge. I am your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today it is time to review another Stephen King book again, one book closer to being able to do tier list number 2 for the author. Still have one more to go. We'll be covering that here before too horribly long early in the year. It'll be this quarter, but first, we have to talk about Firestarter, because I read this in December. It was certainly an interesting adventure, but what did I think of it? Do I think it's underrated? Do I think it's a hidden gem like some people do? Do I think it ended terribly? All of these types of questions we shall find out, beginning with how I normally start these reviews, being the good. What did I actually like about Firestarter? And there were a number of good things to enjoy about the book, in my opinion. The main thing that stuck out to me, however, was the very solid parent-to-child dynamic here in the book. The father, Andy, with the daughter, Charlie. The pair is super strong in the book, and is overall the thing that keeps it honestly really engaging for much of its runtime. And furthermore, not just the character dynamics, not just that specific parent-to-child dynamic, the way that these characters engage with the supernatural mystique that Stephen King is wont to include at times is also done in very interesting ways, and ways that I enjoyed quite a bit while reading Firestarter. This also includes things like the cost of using the supernatural powers, and that whole idea, what it is to actually make the decision to do that, what it is to give in, what mental actual anguish does that cause, how much does it really take out of a person to use those kinds of things. These are some questions that are asked and kind of explored in Firestarter, and I think generally it does a pretty good job of doing that. And both of these things combine to make what I think is honestly the really strong part of reading Firestarter is just the entire first half of the book basically is really great. There's those parent-child dynamics that I talked about, there's the supernatural elements, but there's also just the general plot that's going on in the first half that I really enjoy on top of it all. There's a sense of dread and distrust that is kind of, played out throughout basically the entire book, that is often very palpable, but most especially in the first half of the book with the cat and mouse game, the kind of chase and runaway that is going on throughout the entire first half of the book. It's really engaging. I really enjoyed reading the first half of the book solely because of that cat and mouse game going on, and more than just the general run-of-the-mill cat and mouse whatever, you also have some pretty solid set piece moments and more legitimate chase sequences and escapes that are always really super exhilarating. King knows how to do these kinds of moments quite well most of the time, and does so just up to par in Firestarter, including in times where, the exhilaration isn't necessarily with, nonstop action per se. There are sometimes some subtler, quieter, tenser moments that still have that Stephen King flair to them that just make them really stand out, and that's really great. Also, there are some other random moments throughout the book where you get sparks of wow, yeah, that section was really solid. There's one pretty early on in the book where you're learning some of the history of Andy, the father in the book, that is really great, how he came to be where he is, and you get a couple of these flashbacks within moments where he's unconscious or asleep or something like that, which is a pretty interesting way to cover some of the material within the book, but we'll talk about some of that later, because not always does this type of thing weave into the narrative the best, but generally there are a couple sequences like this of that flashback sort and, sort of related that are really solid. And another thing that I personally really liked about Firestarter, though I'm not necessarily going to say this is an objectively great thing about the book per se, is that I really liked the ending, actually. The back half wasn't as strong as the front half was as a whole, and we'll talk about that here in just a little bit, but the climax and resolution of Firestarter I thought was really solid, and basically did what the book was setting out to do, and it also leaves off on a somewhat open note that I think actually really works for the sort of topics that are being explored here. It's not closed off, not say in the way that the Dead Zone is closed off, for example, and we'll talk about the Dead Zone a little bit here later, but yeah, I genuinely really liked the ending as a whole, and the way that it brought back some stuff from the first half of the book that I really liked, given that I didn't love the back half as much overall. I don't know how much that particular opinion is going to fit in with everybody else, but I was super into it. But that's going to take us into the bad, where there are a couple of these things that I've mentioned here that are going to come back around in the bad of Firestarter. The first thing is that the way that the timeline is set is kind of funky sometimes. That's not to say that Firestarter is non-linear or anything weird like that. There's just moments of like flashback sequences or moments where King utilizes this sort of technique to reveal information, but then like there are other times where he like gives us the same information in more or less the same way at a different time in a different way, and just points of there are multiple points in time where Firestarter feels like it's not repetitive necessarily in what's happening, but sometimes repetitive in what it's actually saying and what it's actually revealing to you. Certainly redundant at a couple points as well. I think the intricacies of the structure, as far as like some of these flashback sequences and some of the ways that some of the information is revealed and talked about, could have been touched up and cleaned up a bit, because like I said, there are times where it's a little bit repetitive or redundant, or like we're getting something that we've already seen or heard before, or where King will like reference something in a paragraph, and so we know that detail now, and then a little bit later there will be a flashback that'll be like as if it's trying to reveal that information to us, but he already kind of like told us a few pages or a couple chapters before. So just weird little things that are like, this book needed another edit pass, I think, to really like make everything click together. I think there were just some things that needed to be moved around, and not necessarily in terms of the plot per se, just some of the details of stuff that were like, it's not the cleanest book in that way. The other thing that I do want to comment about Firestarter is that the back half is not nearly as strong as the first half, in my opinion. The cat and mouse game is over by the time you hit the halfway point. There's a sort of bait and switch where you think that one character is kind of done for at the halfway point, and you think that maybe they're not going to come back in the back half, question mark. But that's a bait and switch that I wasn't super into, but if it did anything, it effectively lets you know that the back half was going to be doing something a little bit different, and certainly it does that. Things become a little bit more of a waiting game, and I think that the back half is a little bit drawn out as a result. It's not super dreadful. It's not like, oh man, this is boring now, please just get on with it. But there are points where it's like, I feel like this didn't need to take as long as it is currently taking, and that happens quite often in the back half. Like, I still enjoyed the material, but it is notably weaker than the front half as a result, maybe just because of how starkly different in pace it is from the front half. I'm not entirely sure, but that is certainly how I felt. The other thing that I do want to note is that while I really like the main characters, Andy and Charlie, and then there's a couple others that are really great, like some of the side characters like Rainbird, the Manders as well are also really good side characters. Overall, the side characters are pretty hit or miss, and that's a little bit of a complaint. Like I said, some of them, like Rainbird and the Manders, are pretty solid as far as side characters go, and they have a great dynamic with the main characters, or the way that they exist within the plot works overall. But there are some other characters that are weirdly flat and, don't pop the way that Stephen King characters typically tend to. There's Cap that doesn't really feel like he's doing that much. He feels more like he's serving a role in the story rather than like he's his own character. That's not often something that I've felt with Stephen King characters. There's other shop characters. You know what I mean by shop if you've read the book, characters of the shop. Cap is one of those characters, but there are other shop members as well that are just kind of whatever. They don't really do much besides the purpose that they serve in the narrative, and don't have any personality beyond that, basically, which is like fine. They're utilized okay, but there are ways in which this is disappointing. Most notably is the fact that Cap and at least one other shop character were characters that I kept getting confused in my head for basically the entire book, actually, which is also not something that I've really struggled with King characters, and the fact that I don't even remember which other shop character, despite like looking up a character list from the book. Just like, which character was like, did I keep getting Cap confused with? I don't even know. Like, I straight up couldn't remember. So that's a little bit awkward as well. The side characters in Firestarter are definitely not anywhere near as memorable as they tend to be in most of his other books. You know, the main characters and a couple of the side characters are great, but most of them are not quite up to snuff, in my opinion. But that's going to take us into the ugly, and you remember earlier that I mentioned the Dead Zone. Well, the reason I mentioned the Dead Zone, and the reason why I talk about that in context of Firestarter so much, is because the Dead Zone came out a year before Firestarter did, which means that people who were reading Stephen King books, you know, back to back as they were coming out, which I'm sure even by the time the Dead Zone and Firestarter were coming out was no small number of people, given the success that he had had with a few previous entries. That's also the way that I read these books. I'm doing an approximately chronological release order reading for Stephen King, and that means that I read The Dead Zone, you know, halfway through 2025, and then I read Firestarter at the end of 2025. Those were my back-to-back King reads for the year, basically. You know, obviously not back-to-back per se, but they were the most in context with one another, and that is an important point for the ugly. That is that Firestarter is distractingly similar to The Dead Zone. The fact that these were published beside one another is a little bit weird. If I was the publisher, I would have been like, we can't publish this book because it's like doing too much of the same thing that the Dead Zone is doing to a certain degree. The supernatural angle is there. There's the character focus, even though the Dead Zone is primarily on one character and this is like on a pair of characters. But between the character focus, the main character focus anyway, the supernatural angle of it, and the way that the powers are kind of utilized and basically bring forth the climax of the book, means that a lot of what these books are doing structurally and conceptually is very, very similar. And like I said, they released 1 year apart from each other, and that is just kind of weird. It's very difficult to read Firestarter, for me at least. This was my experience, without just thinking of the Dead Zone the entire time, especially when you consider the fact that this book is much weaker, you know, executing on some of those ideas. I think that the Dead Zone is primarily a character study, but uses that to weave into a plot that becomes the end of the book, whereas Firestarter is primarily a relationship study between the main characters, and then the plot is like kind of forcing them into certain things, and some of that stuff is great, like in the first half, but then in the back half, the plot becomes like the focus, and you lose some of the character aspects, so it just kind of fizzles out, I guess. All in all, you know, Firestarter is a much weaker execution of its concept relative to the Dead Zone, and given that they are so similar and that I read them back to back, it's just, I kept thinking about that book that I much, much preferred while reading this one, which isn't the best thing to come out feeling. So what does all this mean in terms of a recommendation, you might ask? Well, the easiest way that I can make a recommendation for Firestarter is by continuing to utilize this comparison with the Dead Zone. My rating for the Dead Zone was a 4.5 out of 5, which I rounded up on Goodreads to 5 stars, whereas my rating for Firestarter is a 3.5 out of 5, which I rounded down to 3. So if you look on Goodreads, it looks like the difference between these is 2 stars, which isn't quite true. It's more like 1 to 1.5 star difference-ish that you're getting in terms of the difference of the quality of these, but it is still a notable difference for all intents and purposes. You know, it's hard to recommend Firestarter when I personally feel like it is just so similar to the Dead Zone, but also not as good, you know. For all intents and purposes, I do recommend this. You know, I don't think it's a bad book. I don't think that you should actively avoid it if you're reading all of Stephen King's stuff. It's not like, oh yeah, you should read all of King except for Firestarter, because up to this point, I don't feel like that's the case. It's not bad. But if you're going for an early era Stephen King book that kind of goes a little bit relatively under the radar, I'm picking The Dead Zone all the way and recommending that to people. Probably not going to think of this one very much when I could just pick that one. So that's the way that I see it. Sorry about that, my camera froze for some reason. I think that's the first time I've experienced that before. But anyway, that is going to be the end of this review, and the end of my first review for 2026. Thank you for watching. If you're interested, you can stick around for my 2025 reading tier list video coming out on Thursday. That'll be part 1 of that. There'll be 2 parts of that where I rank every book that I read in 2025, of which Firestarter was one of them. So you can check out the first part of that on Thursday. Next week, I've got another supernatural horror review ready for you. And then part 2 of the tier list will come out, a week from this Thursday as well. So I hope you're willing to check out any of that. But for now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.